The Payday franchise is no stranger to being called a dead game. Hell, Payday 2's held that title through some of its most active years, finally getting an outfit in its last content update as one final middle finger to those drones down in the Steam comments section. You've got to say, across those years, Starbreeze really have learnt to laugh at themselves, which has been a useful skill given their history. And the irony was surely not lost on them when, not 1 month on from signing off Payday 2's legacy after its 10th anniversary with one last bit of dead game humour, people in their droves were already calling their new title, Payday 3, the exact same thing. And with just a glance at the numbers after the server fiasco at launch and an inability to update the game for weeks, development started to reflect that sentiment. That Payday 3 wasn't long for this world, with a slew of unpopular mechanics, systems, and limited repetitive content. Even 10 months later, it's not come close to stepping out of its predecessor's shadow in terms of player numbers, which still stands as Payday 3's staunchest competition. You think they might have learned from Raid World War II, nothing can seemingly compete with Payday 2's co-op heisting gameplay loop after a massive 10 years of iteration and improvement. However, give them their due, they're damn well trying to keep Payday 3's head above water, with Operation Meditbag slowly addressing these core complaints and finally starting to reverse the player count trend. I am well aware we have a long way to go though. I still think a massive portion of the game's core audience has been alienated by a baffling change for change's sake game design philosophy. However, it is getting somewhere, and so people in the community are rightfully asking, can this supposed dead game be saved from the brink to see another year of content? Do we have any case studies to inform how this sort of situation can play out? And are there any lessons to learn from what studios have done right by their audiences and where they've doubled down on mistakes in the past? In today's video, I'm going to study the life cycles of 4 relatively recent game releases that haven't gone entirely to plan, with half of those turning that ship around and still thriving to this day, whilst the other 2 are now a footnote in history somewhere in a death of a game video. The hope is that we can get some insight into the strategies we might see Starbreeze employ over the next few months, giving us a little premonition of what must be done to keep the Payday franchise around for at least 1 more decade. Let's go chronologically, starting with 2016's No Man's Sky, the procedurally generated space exploration game that overpromised tremendously prior to launch, garnering a huge following in the process, but was met with absolute ridicule come launch. With an E3 trailer that really impressed at a time when downgrades and overpromising during the promotional cycle was starting to be met with greater scrutiny, the craziest thing about No Man's Sky's hype cycle was that almost every apparent feature that seemed too good to be true was insisted upon. So when, unsurprisingly, they were missing or entirely oversold at launch, the gaming community at large turned on the developer almost immediately. Glancing at the Steam charts alone, No Man's Sky's launch figures from August 2016 dropped from a mighty 212,000, which by the way it's never reached since, all the way down to just 9,000 by mid-September, retaining about 4% of its initial PC player base. This was even more damning for a title that wasn't exactly marketed as a one-and-done single-player experience. It was meant to be a sandbox that kept players engaged for months or even years, so this lack of player retention, alongside the negative press around misinformation and advertising regulation within the game industry, left it in very real danger of being abandoned. Development studio Hello Games and its founder Sean Murray kinda disappeared off the face of the earth in the immediate aftermath, but despite the reputation he'd garnered as a bold-faced liar, there's something to be said for how he knuckled down with his team to make almost everything he overpromised an eventual reality. I actually have a degree of sympathy for how Sean got caught up in his own hype, and whilst I don't think the PR backlash he received in the wake of this disappointing launch was undeserved, I have to commend the way he really rescued his reputation over the intervening years. It would be easy to just call him overly ambitious and unrealistic, with a dev team in just the double figures backing up most of Murray's overblown claims, but over the years post-launch, they made them into retroactive truths. The Atlas Rises update, almost a year on from launch, made an initial dent in player figures that had fallen below 1,000 at the time, bringing the promised narrative content from launch before the even larger No Man's Sky Next update in July 2018 finally tackled multiplayer's conspicuous absence, which had been infamously alluded to pre-launch, bouncing back to almost 97,000 concurrent Steam players as a result. The game is now massive, having ticked most of the boxes expected at launch and then some, with dozens of additional free updates over the years. It's now a beloved title, with Steam reviews sitting at mostly positive, which is quite a feat after the dreadful release, as few people tend to go back and alter the feedback they initially give. Hell, it's even been nominated for the Steam Labour of Love Award on 4 separate occasions. Whilst player figures 8 years on from launch aren't what they used to be, sitting at around a 5,500 current average on Steam in the past month, they're perfectly serviceable for a game of its age, and seem to fluctuate around sizable updates, showing that a core returning audience have remained with the game throughout its impressive rags to riches success story. Except calling it that might be a bit disingenuous. You see, No Man's Sky was a critical failure at launch, but it was certainly not a commercial failure. Despite the sizable drop-off in the months that followed the launch due to the hype bubble bursting, it still did a lot of the heavy lifting in making the game one of the top sellers of 2016, which is even more impressive when you consider the relative development costs given the size of the team working on it. It's this initial financial success that enabled Hello Games to go silent and just crack on with development, obviously not having to face up to community backlash as they were comparatively unbothered by Sony's shareholder noise. On a smaller scale, we saw something similar with Payday 3. Despite its launch success being modest in comparison, they were hesitant to respond directly to community concerns about the broken servers, or even tell the community they were willing to pivot from particularly unpopular systems, until it became clear they were having tangible impacts on sales and their bottom line. I'll never forget that things were treated as business as usual until after the Steam Winter Sale and release of Syntax Error, and one was certain that if sales had been higher than expected, we wouldn't have seen an Operation Merit Bag at all, regardless of the community backlash. However, when we look at the No Man's Sky case study, we can see there is actually value in filtering out the noise and handling the critical feedback that's actually coming from the audience who plays your game obsessively. Sean Murray's strategy was reportedly to stop communicating with the press, who just wanted headlines for clicks anyway, and instead patch notes became how they let the community know they were listening, creating a bit of a one-way feedback loop that worked for them. I do wonder if Payday can learn from this, avoiding all the industry chatter and just hitting those key feedback points that need addressing directly, instead of patting themselves on the back every time they seem to add a basic feature. It was an interesting solution Hello Games found that I think is much harder for a more established community-facing company such as Starbreeze to pull off, but I do believe there's more value in the actions of the company rather than their words, especially when they can so easily be misconstrued and end up biting them on the arse, as with Almir's recent "We Need You Now" controversy. Payday 3 has also under-delivered on its promise, which is partially our fault as Payday creators for hyping it up pre-launch. If you just go off the trailer material, it's not as if anything was missold, but initial reviews and feedback from Gamescom showcase that the game is incredibly good at appearing to have mechanical depth and fast build variety at a glance, which is what we were suckered into. It's only after about a day with the game you start to see through those cracks and the issues with these systems become more apparent. Especially those technical issues that made the game almost unplayable for the first few weeks. They blindsided just about everyone, Starbreeze included, when the game went fully live. All the new stealth tech turned out to be useless, as the God AI is just as abusable as ever, and allowed gunplay is limited by the shallow design of the heist roster. To a Payday fan, this is about as impactful as dropping without multiplayer or a developed narrative. Just like No Man's Sky, Payday needs to put its money where its mouth is and give these missing or underbaked systems a new lease of life. Pivotally, that can't just be via DLC. One of the reasons No Man's Sky earned community forgiveness so quickly was they never charged an addition to the base cost of admission for any of these features. Everything was fixed at no extra cost, funded by its initial success. Payday 3 doesn't have that luxury, and it's working alongside a very metrics-first publisher in Plyon, so we know not everything can be offered up for free, but it's pivotal that the base game experience lives up to the promise without needing to charge for more special editions in the future. Regardless, it's certainly a lesson in controlling the narrative and hype around your game, and simply knuckling down to mould it into the shape its community expects, with as little pomp and ceremony as possible. Hell, even whilst I was writing this script, the game was given yet another lease of life with its version 5.0 trailer, showcasing a complete visual overhaul which simply looks gorgeous. No Man's Sky really is a labour of love that's been given the time and space to fulfill its potential, even in spite of some well-deserved ridicule at launch. Before we move on to the always fun to discuss Cyberpunk, just a moment to talk about this video's sponsor, Factor, the pre-prepared meal delivery service. Factor provides a diverse menu of chef-crafted, fresh not frozen, ready-to-eat meals, requiring just 2 minutes of heating before you can tuck in. Upon heading over to their website, you'll be greeted with 35 impressive options, changing weekly, ranging from vegan and veggie to protein plus if you're lucky to spend a little more time at the gym, like myself. No prep, no cook time, no mess. Factor can save you hours out of your week. Working full time whilst juggling this channel does leave me wide open to the potential overpriced takeaway trap, but Factor is a cheaper, tastier, and even faster alternative for you. So get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders using my link. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. That's 50% off the first box, 20% off your next 4 boxes. Factor is the perfect remedy for this summer heat, cutting down on kitchen time to enjoy the great outdoors or just play another heist. Regardless, a huge thank you again for sponsoring this video. It's time for game number 2. Probably the most infamous nightmare release to turn it all around in recent years, especially in terms of scope, mainstream news coverage and lasting impact, has to be Cyberpunk 2077. CD Projekt Red's public stock in the wake of the immense success of The Witcher 3 was in the stratosphere, especially when it came to crafting open worlds, interesting narratives, and developing role-playing systems. First revealed as early as 2012, this game lived in the washing machine hype cycle for far longer than any game should, losing control of its own supposed feature list and community expectations. The trailer most of us remember was from E3 2018, which built up the world of Night City and set those expectations through the roof. Its style, setting, and premise was incredible, and so the budding community just ran with whatever they saw, working from still images and a heavily manufactured trailer that already showed a few signs of the instability to come. Once more, this is a great example of overpromising and under-delivering. Whilst it was a lot more passive than the hype cycle No Man's Sky built for itself, it was just as out of control as the game neared its release date, which was again repeatedly set back, pointing to the difficulties developers were already having with the game's scope and the planned release on both current and previous generations of console. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, Payday 3 also ran into issues of overpromising when reviewers weren't given enough time with the game to understand its features properly, overblowing what you'd actually be capable of in-game, and let me tell you from personal experience, these notions were never shut down or tempered by the devs we spoke to. With the hype around Cyberpunk 2077 at fever pitch and Keanu calling it breathtaking, it seemed nothing could go wrong, which is a dangerous expectation that makes the fall that much harder. It's also worth noting that Cyberpunk reviewed really well at first, with reviewers only getting to experience the game at its very best on the most functional hardware. If I remember correctly, back to pre-launch, 8 or 9 out of 10 was the critical consensus, with the bugs, a vapid world, and less refined systems being overshadowed by the sheer scope, player choice, and excellent presentation. I should probably remind you that Payday 3 was similarly averaging a solid score between 7 and 8 out of 10 from most publications at launch, with only its repetitive nature and limited content offering being heavily criticised. It's interesting how these games can seemingly slip through the cracks of the critical lens until they're subjected to the unfettered appraisal of the wider player base. Speaking of, come launch day on December 10th, 2020, 8 years after being announced, Cyberpunk 2077 finally launched in what can only be described as an unmitigated disaster. On all platforms, the game was chock full of visual and gameplay impacting bugs, missing many of the anticipated systems the community had just sort of dreamed up over that long wait cycle, and had some seriously major performance issues that left it functionally unplayable in some cases. None of that CD Projekt Red polish we expected. From a QA perspective, just about everything that could have gone wrong did. Unexpected nudity, constantly T-posing NPCs, nightmarish visual bugs, artifacting, and barely functional physics. It got worse and worse the less powerful your machine was, especially if you were stuck playing on the previous generation of console, but more on that in a second. Let's just say it heralded the golden age of bug compilation videos. Whilst Payday 3 didn't have issues on that scale, being relatively well QA'd for performance and functionality in a controlled setting, as soon as the game shifted to live servers, everything went wrong. The servers went down, PlayStation players were only given access to the beta version including just a single heist, one of the special edition masks crashed the game, and controller support was completely out of whack. I mentioned those last gen consoles briefly just a second ago, but calling what happened to the PS4 version performance issues would be doing them a disservice. The game was an outright embarrassment for CD Projekt Red on PlayStation 4, reaching a point where public outcry led to a delisting from the PlayStation Store less than a week after launch. It came back several weeks later after a few patches, but I imagine the reputational and financial damage was already done by then. In fact, reports state they ended up issuing over $50 million in refunds as a direct consequence of this botched release, but that's not even considering the intangible damage it did to their brand, or the outright shitstorm of news and exposés that followed along with it. The extent of this failed launch brought a lot of attention to the studio's culture of crunch and mandatory overtime, with stories of employee mistreatment, another tangible issue CD Projekt had to deal with. At Starbreeze, from the outside looking in, the company culture and camaraderie seems really solid, although live service studios have a reputation for needing to meet constantly approaching deadlines, leading to contractually mandated overtime. Bearing in mind their own technical issues at launch, and patching nightmares that are still present as of the most recent update, and positive crunch is still around, even if it doesn't involve people sleeping at the office like they did back in the old Crime Fest days. The worry is that this leads to high employee attrition rates, a lack of developer continuity, and a studio that barely understands its own key franchise. Switching the focus back to the game itself, what's actually interesting about the critical reception of Cyberpunk is that if critics waded through the obvious talking point of this game is buggy and dug down into its core mechanics at launch, they would have realised a lot more needed to be done to the game than for it just to run better. The world was oddly lifeless and underutilised, building a character was obtrusive and uninteresting, and the story was not well paced, despite excellent character performances. It's a perfect example of performance issues managing to take the heat off the game's actual fundamental problems because they draw so much of the community's ire. A similar thing occurred with Payday 3, and I'm just as guilty of only seeing the immediate issue at the time when I made the best game you can't play video. Let's be honest, those servers were just doing us a favour by breaking, saving ourselves from the monotonous bathroom grind at launch. It was easy to miss the glaring issues with all the extra noise, but progression, the skill system, armour and the lack of randomisation soon came to the forefront of the conversation once servers seemed reasonably stable. Fortunately, it seems for both games, these issues were directly addressed even when they weren't the centre of attention, as Cyberpunk, as of the current patch, puts its day one version to shame in terms of content density, gameplay functionality, and replayability. Payday 3 is getting there. I can only hope they don't sweep its remaining issues under the rug once the key talking points are addressed. The publicly traded CD Projekt Red share price has hovered around roughly a quarter of what it was in the lead up to this launch, if you want any indication of the lasting damage its torrid launch has done. However, it's certainly not been a fatal slip up for the company, or even for the game, as Cyberpunk 2077 as of 2024 is seen as a bit of a sleeper masterpiece, maligned by a horrid release that has got better and better and pivotally more stable with every single patch. There are lots of reasons for this recovery, not least the fact that even with its record refund figures, CD Projekt still shifted a lot of full price units of the game, giving them the financial foundation and install base to build out from there. They also had the foundations of a decent game, with some systems coming close to meeting expectations. Naturally, having years worth of goodwill in the bank after The Witcher's success must have also come in handy, and let's not forget, at its core, Cyberpunk was still a pretty unassailably excellent concept for an open world video game if they pulled everything together. Payday 3 reflects elements of this. Player figures at launch were really impressive, much higher than anticipated, and comfortably enough to take down those Axelbyte servers, leaving the company cash rich and hopefully ready for major investment heading into 2024. The game feels good to play, if only in short bursts, before its more shallow systems come to the fore, and you can't argue with the premise of a good Heat-inspired heisting game. Reputation-wise, Starbreeze's once good name has been dragged through the mud a fair bit recently, especially when under the stewardship of ex-CEO Bo Anderson in the wake of Overkill's The Walking Dead's failure, alongside all those other wild ventures like the Valhalla engine and Star VR. However, they somehow maintain that plucky underdog veneer and have their avid supporters who might as well have funded Payday 3 by buying into Payday 2 once more. Whilst they lack the star power of CD Projekt Red, they're still in a relatively solid position to recover. And just like The Witcher devs, it won't even be their first rodeo. You see, The Witcher 1 was another great example of a scope-crept game from a studio that just couldn't quite handle it at first, riddled with bugs and issues. The Enhanced Edition was released 1 year later, boasting a slew of game-breaking bug fixes, faster load times, and new systems. It was a Cyberpunk scope overhaul before Cyberpunk was even a twinkle in their eye, making the crucial first title in one of the most iconic RPG series of all time actually playable at last. Starbreeze, back when they were called Overkill, also displayed a genuine commitment to improve and iterate on Payday 2 at launch, which has me at least hoping they can pull off the same with the sequel. So how did this all work out for Cyberpunk in the end? Step 1 was of course supporting the game with those initial stability fixes, but apparently Step 2 was an approach a few studios could match, coming completely out of the blue. Branching out Cyberpunk's media reach and franchise power with the creation of a new animated series, Edgerunners. Studio Trigger absolutely nailed it with this show, premiering on Netflix. With rave critical reviews, Cyberpunk was initially well suited to the anime style, capturing a new audience without relying on brand recognition as so many video game adaptations seem to. Not only did this rekindle passion for the franchise at just the right moment in late 2022, it developed the world and setting fantastically. We all know there's something rumbling as far as the Payday franchise's cross-media presence is concerned after the partnership with Swedish-American production studio Stockholm Syndrome was announced, but the fact we've heard very little else recently makes me wonder if this is on the back burner. If it comes to fruition and has half the budget and quality of Edgerunners, it might just help reshape the game's public perception and finally give a little depth to Payday 3's currently lukewarm storyline. But Edgerunners alone could never be the sole reason Cyberpunk has managed its 180 since launch. It just created the perfect conditions to allow the Phantom Liberty DLC to thrive. Coming alongside the massive 2.0 update and off the back of its rekindled popularity, Cyberpunk was given the best chance at redemption. 2.0 overhauled the game's loot, gear and skill systems, key gameplay areas that when changed encouraged even tenured players to pick up the game and start all over again from scratch. In many ways, this was a free, soft relaunch of the game, delivered alongside a truly quality paid DLC expansion in the form of Phantom Liberty to offer even more fresh new content to enjoy. This expansion has been widely praised, with a maturity to its storytelling that gives a lot more purpose to the now much improved combat gameplay. It again indicates how pivotal it is the game's base foundations are fixed first, upon which any future paid content can stand alone without being marred by past development mistakes. Syntax error for Payday 3 was lost in the controversy surrounding the game's initial launch. Boys in Blue is fun, but feels trapped inside fiddly systems it has already outgrown. I think it's absolutely pivotal that the next two Payday expansions are given the room they need to succeed with supporting free updates. I'm positive, without 2.0, Phantom Liberty wouldn't have been able to shine as it has, and that same blueprint of offering a new and improved base experience alongside an expanded world is exactly what Payday 3 has to emulate if it's going to nail the marketing heading into its 1-year anniversary. Up next, on the gloomier side of the coin, Back 4 Blood is a really interesting example of a game that is now considered functionally dead by most, as its live service component has been officially shelved by its developer, but the great irony of including Back 4 Blood in this video isn't lost on me, as despite being discontinued as of February 2023, it still has notably more daily concurrent players than Payday 3 over on Steam. It's also uncanny just how much this title and its developer, Turtle Rock Studios, has in common with Payday and Starbreeze, so I just couldn't avoid talking about it here. The game is currently outperforming Payday 3 for a myriad of reasons, particularly the fact that it received at least solid support over its development span, with 3 major expansions and some system tweaks that were well received, even if the current experience remains fundamentally unfinished. Payday 3's not even reached that stage in the live service lifecycle just yet. Gaining a functional offline mode with actual progression was seemingly enough to keep the game up in the thousands of players even in 2024, which Payday 3 is of course still lacking. But despite minor resurgences tied to sales, the game is still for all intents and purposes dead, so let's find out why and how closely its failings tie to the woes of Payday 3. I think more so than anything, Back 4 Blood's reliance on its reputation as a spiritual successor to a much loved earlier game that it was always quietly competing with dragged it down. Infamously, Back 4 Blood was virtually marketed as Left 4 Dead 3, despite only having a fraction of its legendary development team actually on board. This raised expectations sky high and pigeonholed them into being viewed through that Left 4 Dead lens, and held to its high standards. Payday 3 actually suffers from similar issues, coming from even closer to home, of course being a direct sequel to the almost 11-year-old Payday 2 made by the same studio. Pivotally though, it was also made by a very different development team. There's likely more overlap with the Overkill's The Walking Dead crew, just given the relative recency of those two games. That tiny, core Payday 2 dev team from back in 2013 is tremendously fragmented by now. Of course, this discrepancy has been met with ridicule from the start. Initial trailers were described mockingly as Payday 2 reskins, lacking original ideas, whilst post-launch, people are gagging for a return to a lot of the sequel's old features after finding out Payday 3 had pivoted on many key systems. They were damned either way simply by association, but taking the riskier option and straying further away from the winning formula and desperately attempting to modernise for the current gaming landscape was not a well-received strategy for either company. Both always run the risk of living in the shadow of their more established source of inspiration, and also have to compete directly for a player base, unsuccessfully in both cases so far. At least to Payday 3's credit, competing with an established live service that was actively developed for 10 years is understandably challenging. Back 4 Blood was bare bones compared to a 12-year-old full release, as how its content was presented and where it was focused remained an issue for the devs throughout 2022. The game's PvP was lambasted, again with comparisons to the versus mode expected from Left 4 Dead doing them no favours. Overall, content scope also disappointed the community, releasing with just 4 acts comprising of short missions with limited replayability and variation. That's a sentiment all too familiar for Payday 3 fans, for whom heists play out as exact carbon copies every time, with very limited planning tools and RNG to shake things up. 8 heists is what we launched with, which, much like Back 4 Blood, probably led to the steepest decline in initial player base as the community essentially experienced the entirety of the game's content in the first few hours, with only the most hardcore returning for more of the same. Both games also struggle with performance and stability on launch, additionally turning early adopters away and landing their titles with a stained reputation that in some cases never washes away. It's funny, they also both supported unusual progression systems at launch, which derailed the enjoyment for some. These systems might have had their merits on paper, but it's hard to not see them as half-baked tools to unnaturally elongate playtimes and give the illusion of more content and replayability from a fan perspective. Much of the progression in Back 4 Blood was tied to an RNG card system, which seems a bit dissonant with the genre and themes. It's evidently intended as an almost roguelike replayability tool, but in the main, it was received as an unnecessary subversion of the formula, not too dissimilar to Payday 3's mostly dumbed down and inconvenient skills. You can argue amongst yourselves as to whether Payday 3's launch challenge progression system was any better, forcing you into strange playstyles you might not have enjoyed to hit max level. At the very least, Payday 3 has already addressed this, returning to a classic XP-based system that just about everyone seems to prefer. I think special attention, in the case of Back 4 Blood's earlier than expected abandonment, has to be placed on the studio responsible. Turtle Rock had started to garner a reputation for abandoning their games, especially after Evolve went the way of the dinosaurs. This hits a little close to home when you consider Overkill's The Walking Dead was Starbreeze's last major project, before begrudgingly returning to create DLC for Payday 2. The circumstances around the game's shutdown are far more complicated and shouldn't just be laid at Starbreeze's feet, but it's still a massive blot on their record. With February 2023 marking the end of development for Back 4 Blood, a 17-month post-launch cycle, I can't help but be reminded of that 18-month Plaion Publishing deal signed for Payday 3. Similarly, Turtle Rock have also moved on to work on another game and reportedly couldn't spare any devs for Back 4 Blood. It's actually a little chilling, to be honest, with Project Baxter waiting in the wings for Starbreeze. They even both opted for the Day 1 Game Pass treatment, a new favourite of live services concerned with their offerings at launch, opening up virtually free access to owners of the service to immediately install a fair-weather player base. It creates the illusion of an active community, but given the low barriers to entry, many of these prospective Game Pass players are passing tourists at best. I'd love to know how many have been put off from trying Payday 3 from minute 1 just because of the cumbersome process of creating a Nebula account. I think a lot of people would say the writing was on the wall early on for Back 4 Blood though. You see, the meager content offering at launch was expanded upon via paid DLC updates, the first coming in April 2022, a long 7 months post-launch, leading to a content drought that leaked players as a result. They didn't have the same issues with functionally updating the game as Starbreeze did, running into account and cross-platform challenges, but the fact that so much of the initial expansionary content for it was paid can't have helped its reputation. The April expansion itself didn't do much to recover the player base, bouncing back to only about 1/5 of its launch figures on Steam. Future expansions also lacked content scope for their price point, creating discussions around DLC value and not helping the overarching replayability issues. We've been there before ourselves with syntax error for Payday 3, a fine if limited paid update that felt repulsively overpriced. This desire to monetize the game for as long as it was a worthwhile cash cow or publisher contracted seemed to be mirrored in how Back 4 Blood treated its DLC content. It never felt like there was a desire to treat the community properly and transform it into a franchise with organic staying power. It seemed more like a business cycle for the studio. I'm not saying Payday 3 will go that way too, in fact they've done well to pivot their DLC pricing as of the second expansion, Boys in Blue, but the way initial DLCs were modelled with their ludicrous price point that was designed to sell more special editions did have me a little worried. The similarities between these games just keep coming though, especially in how they've departed from a key external feature of their predecessors, that being a well-supported modding community. Let's be honest, Payday 2 on PC was carried by modders over the years, and Left 4 Dead 2 had its own incredibly vibrant scene. Whilst mods aren't outwardly discouraged by Starbreeze, the switch to Unreal Engine and the always online approach has passively wounded that key component of the community. Modding Payday 3 is a lot harder than it should be, and the scope of what can be done seems much more limited. Paired with the fact the game simply isn't as beloved at this stage, the normally active modding scene has stagnated, limiting that usually reliable source of community-generated content, which sometimes takes the heat off the devs. Somehow, they also both moved away from the functionality of an offline mode at launch, although the de novo bullet was dodged by Payday 3. It's funny because I think it's really clear at this point that people expressly enjoy playing co-op games as solo players, and so an offline single-player mode that's properly supported and integrated feels like a must-have for these titles. Payday 2 learned that over time, developing bots that might be too competent, all things considered, but both newer titles have virtually ignored the key function, prioritizing an always online system, in Payday's case likely to protect its planned microtransactions. Payday 3 plans to follow in Back 4 Blood's footsteps with a fully integrated offline mode in the works and a semi-functional solo mode already here. But if it's going to properly support a solo playstyle, the game will also need to develop the crew AI and avoid heist designs that expressly punish solo players. And this final point is certainly up for debate, but I believe the lifelessness of Unreal Engine has also contributed to both games' lack of personality and charm. They're absolutely competent and clean, but almost to a fault, leaving behind the freeform grittiness that made their respective prequels so special. I'm not saying they should have gone with Diesel for Payday 3, it was an old and frankly strange engine to develop a game with, by all accounts, but it was also a tool Starbreeze were adept with and always got the most out of, giving Payday 2 its unique feel and some of the most iconic mechanics, believe it or not. They had to capture that magic and bottle it into Unreal, and to be frank, that's not translated so far. It's all too generic, which I think is an argument that can also be made for how Back 4 Blood looks and feels, losing what Source Engine had to make Left 4 Dead 2 so special. Last up, soon on its way to the retirement home, is Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. This one actually does have worse player numbers than Payday 3 on Steam, not experiencing such a fall from grace, but never capturing the same level of interest in the first place, which might be an even greater red flag for a game than a loss of popularity. Conversely to Back 4 Blood, this game isn't officially dead, with Season 2 launching on the 25th of July after being delayed from the 11th, but all the external noise around it is that the publisher, Warner Bros., has already written it off as a failed venture and it's not expected to recover. By all accounts, the development team is still not directly addressing community concerns, and this is just a case of Rocksteady execs burying their heads in the sand and completing the release of promised and likely pre-developed content before that dreaded corporate PNG hits our screens. This one had another ridiculously lengthy dev cycle, first being mentioned as early as 2010, switching studios, and then being repeatedly delayed. It's just a sign of a game lacking direction and any real creative continuity, I think. I always wonder if Payday 3 suffered from a similar identity crisis, bearing in mind Bo was talking about it as early as 2016, with the game coming out almost 7 years later. Sometimes a more focused dev cycle with less second guessing, consistency of leadership, and avoidance of dead rubber concepts or mechanics seems to work out better than having all the time in the world. Other reports described a culture of toxic positivity, where despite clear struggles finalising the game, there was a pervasive it'll all work out attitude that prevented Rocksteady from ever addressing concerns head on. Payday 3 felt like it was pushed towards the finish line by sheer determination and confidence the community would support the game no matter what, but in its case, this toxic positivity problem manifested in poorly conceived mechanics being amplified by a positive internal feedback loop, such that when the game came out, there was genuine confusion as to why people didn't really like them. This is why they doubled down on things like pure challenge-based progression and still stand by the old armor system, but I hope will circle back around if the community demand is there for it. Suicide Squad also must just felt like a bit of an aberration to be working on for a team who specialised in crafting single-player experiences in expansive worlds. Faced with a multiplayer dilemma, draped in all the live service trappings that the industry as a whole was turning against, the chips were really stacked against them. Rocksteady just seems to lack an understanding of the live service looter-shooter genre, so never looked like they'd be capable of producing something that could compete with the likes of Destiny. Of course, Payday 3 also categorises itself as a live service, but let's be honest, it really hasn't been, hardly managing the live part, never mind offering an actual service. Both are games that don't want to be categorised this way for different reasons, although the white whale of a ludicrously profitable live service undoubtedly appeals enough to investors and publishers, so they stick to this label. What I do think put the devs at Starbreeze into an awkward position was developing for both PC and console simultaneously, with full crossplay kind of locking them into the decision. Let's be honest, these guys have always struggled with console versions, so it's not a surprise they bit off more than they could chew by promising cross-parity. Most of the initial update woes back in October, when it seemed like they couldn't get an update out to save their lives, were likely tied to issues with console certification as a result of that inexperience developing for console platforms. Back on to Kill the Justice League, the game was struck with sizable delays, which, as I've already mentioned, isn't always a bad sign, and there have been times where I've wished Payday 3 had the same treatment, but delays always do suggest a level of disconnect between decision makers and those tasked with producing the game, and they also tend to lead to greater pressure on the eventual launch, not least due to increased costs. Reportedly, the publisher, Warner Bros. Games, took a $200 million loss from the venture after the game proceeded to sell extremely poorly, which probably gives you a good idea as to whether they think they have a chance of ever recouping those costs with future investment. Payday 3 was at least initially profitable on launch, giving it an install base that might indicate value in pumping more money into it. Moving on from all the issues around the Suicide Squad game's launch, none of this would really matter if it turned out bloody good. But sadly, despite areas of promise, it ended up being mechanically limited and systematically vapid, boiling down to a gun-focused looter shooter with satisfying movement and shooting, but little else to show for it. Being locked into a live service shell meant holding back content to drip feed through a life cycle, and also required the game to carry those addictive progression trappings synonymous with the genre that tends to come at the cost of gameplay. Repetitive and lacking an overarching hook to give it any depth, if you weren't completely sold on the core loop, you probably wouldn't give this one the time of day, and I think Payday 3 suffers from similar problems. Those I know with hundreds of hours in the game all adore something inherent to its feel, be that the shooting or the sneaking, but for most players, a single run through all heists with both strategies will feel like you've experienced everything it has to offer, and without a worthwhile goal to chase or any variety in the gameplay worth exploring, they'll be done after about 5 hours. To make matters worse for Kill the Justice League, they've been lambasted by the dedicated DC fandom for how they've treated the material they had to work with, wasting what was viewed as an excellent narrative concept. The playable characters lack likability or any sort of development, they're stereotypes that never escape their own mould, and Rocksteady have even been criticised for how they've treated iconic characters within the titular Justice League, especially in the wake of Kevin Conroy's passing, the voice of Batman. Season 1 released in March 2024, adding the Joker, who was a highly anticipated character, but the update as a whole also doubled down on a lot of the progression and repetitive gameplay issues that were already present. A mixed update like this one, with plenty of free additions, can be fine in isolation, but appears tone deaf when you consider the community sentiment around the game at the time of its release. Not too dissimilar to what happened with Syntax Error, which launched in the wake of Payday 3's atrocious start to life, with a show must go on attitude that appeared to bulldoze through the obvious issues with the game. I think this showcases how difficult it is for many of these live service games that require publisher sign-offs to pivot. Just look at the situation now with Payday 3, which has taken months of internal and publisher approvals to create a new DLC and update model that fits closer to what the community expects. Fair play to Starbreeze for getting it done, but I'll be amazed if Suicide Squad follows suit, as it seems they're just bracing for the inevitable at this point. In fact, the same Bloomberg article that delved into the many developmental woes this game had also confirmed that Rocksteady staff were already providing support on a Hogwarts Legacy Director's Cut, so it seems the writing's on the wall. So that's the life cycle of 4 massive games over the past decade with vastly differing fates. Much to think about for our boy Payday 3. I do think the takeaways are relatively simple if we take a step back though. There are some very clear do's and don'ts for games that find themselves in this awful position. Do fix what needs to be fixed free of charge. If the game doesn't meet expectations set by your marketing, it must eventually, without costing more than the box price. The community will lap up paid content if incentivized to do so by excellent free supporting editions. Do work on the features that matter to the community the most. Don't be afraid to pivot from initial design decisions that aren't working and move at the same pace as the community does. Don't get bogged down in old news. And do give the game time to flourish and support it with long-term sustainability as a core focus. You can't be short-termist when the game is teetering on the edge of oblivion. Patience will be rewarded, even amidst Sting's earnings in the meantime. But don't double down on your mistakes and refuse to pivot in time. Having too rigid a vision for a game stunts its growth, and communities tend to respond well to devs with a flexible mindset who react to feedback positively. Don't spend too much time flailing around in the marketing machine. Well-implemented fixes and improvements speak for themselves and repair reputations without half as much ridicule. And finally, don't lose touch of what you succeeded with in the past. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel, and development studios specialise in particular types of experience for a reason. Innovation is great when given purpose, but over the past few years a number of studios have been tasked to create games they wouldn't normally, and it's only seemed to end in tears. That all said, I hope you enjoyed this video. It was fun to research for it. I felt like I was back in university again, so let me know if you're a fan of this sort of long-form essay-like content. Thank you so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you all very soon. A huge thank you to my dedicated Patreon backers. If you want to join this crew in going infamous, check out the link below and pledge as little as $2 to see your name in the credits, or get 24-hour early access to future videos and vote on upcoming content. Take care, I'll see you all soon.